Today, we're going to unpack a pretty fiery online debate. It's all about activism, allyship, and how the whole thing kicked off because of a single tragedy and one very controversial hashtag.
I mean, that's really the question at the heart of it all, isn't it? Who owns a hashtag? What happens when a phrase that was created for one very specific struggle gets picked up and used for something else entirely? Well, that is exactly the conflict we're getting into today, and it was all sparked by a viral video critique.
Okay, so how did this all even begin? Well, like a lot of these online firestorms, it started with a tragedy in the real world. Something that quickly snowballed into a symbol for a much, much bigger argument.
The whole thing really centers on the death of a woman named Renee Nicole Good. The debate we're looking at was sparked by people calling to say her name, and it was her death and the very specific details of how it happened that became the catalyst for this whole thing.
So, according to the narrator of the video we're looking at, here's what happened. Renee Good was killed while she was trying to stop federal ICE agents from making an arrest, and the person she was defending? A man named Mohammed Abu Qadir Youssef. The narrator makes a point to describe him as a Somalian illegal alien offender who already had a conviction for first-degree criminal assault. And, for the narrator, that last part is absolutely crucial to their whole argument.
So right away, this one incident just slammed right into an already established activist movement, and it created this huge flashpoint, all over just 3 simple words.
The hashtag in question, of course, is hashtag #SayHerName. Now, this movement got started back in 2014, and the whole point, according to the source, was to raise awareness specifically for Black women and girls who have been victims of police violence, the idea being that their stories and their names were too often forgotten.
And right here, this is the core of the whole conflict. On one side, you have the hashtag's original, very specific purpose, for Black women killed by police. But on the other side, you have it being used for Renee Good, a white woman who died confronting federal agents. It's that disconnect, that gap, that's really where this whole thing just explodes.
The narrator of the video points to this exact pushback. They're seeing people online saying, whoa, hold on. Say her name is for Black women, okay? It's specifically for Black women. And this gatekeeping, as the narrator sees it, is what really becomes the main target of their entire critique.
And this is where the argument really broadens out. It stops being just about a hashtag. The narrator uses this one incident to launch into a much bigger critique of what they call a toxic relationship between activists and their allies.
So the narrator basically asks this question: what exactly is expected of an ally? And they frame their whole argument around what they see as the expectations placed on one group in particular, liberal white women who are allies to movements for people of color.
And here's their pretty provocative summary of what that expectation is. The narrator argues that, essentially, white women are told to use their privilege for good and to basically turn themselves into human shields. They're saying these allies are encouraged to be right there on the front lines, to march, to physically put their bodies on the line. But here's the contradiction the narrator points out. They say that after these allies are asked to make huge sacrifices, and I mean in Renee's case, the ultimate sacrifice, that very same sacrifice is then dismissed or devalued. Like when people refuse to let her be included in the hashtag.
And this quote from the video really drives their point home. The narrator argues that allies are effectively told your tears don't matter and your lives don't matter. This, in their view, creates a really one-sided relationship where your support is demanded, but your own humanity isn't valued in the same way.
So, all of this leads to the narrator's final diagnosis. They just call it a toxic situation. And they give some pretty blunt advice specifically to liberal white women. Just withdraw your support. They're basically saying, hey, this is an unhealthy relationship and it is not working for you.
Okay, so from there, the critique kind of pivots. It moves away from the personal dynamics and into a debate about strategy. The narrator's point is that this whole approach isn't just alienating people. It's just a fundamentally flawed way to try and create real change.
So the narrator lays out what they see as some major strategic failures in the movement. First, it alienates potential allies. Second, it's based more on emotion than on logic. Third, they argue it chooses bad martyrs, people whose cases, like Sandra Bland or Breonna Taylor, are complex and not simple stories of pure innocence. And finally, that it just resorts to calling people names instead of actually debating the facts.
Okay, so what's their solution then? Well, the narrator proposes a pretty big shift in framing. They say, move away from a purely race-based approach and adopt a class-based one instead.
Their argument is that if you frame police violence as a threat that happens to people of all races, you could build a much broader and frankly more effective coalition.
And, from the narrator's point of view, this isn't some new idea they just came up with. They claim they tried to offer this advice years ago, right at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. And what happened? They say they were just dismissed and called a racist for even suggesting it.
And that brings us to the narrator's final message. It's a direct call to action, and it's aimed squarely at the same allies they've been talking about this whole time.
And the message is really, really clear. The narrator is telling these allies, step 1, recognize that this whole situation is toxic. Step 2, stop being a doormat. And step 3, seriously reevaluate who you're giving your support to.
So really, when you boil it all down, the narrator's core argument is pretty simple. You can't build a successful movement by demanding everything from your supporters while also telling them that their lives and their sacrifices don't matter. They just see that as a strategy that's completely, fundamentally unsustainable.
And all of this leaves us with one big, final question to think about. When movements collide like this, who really owns the message? When a symbol or a hashtag takes on a life of its own, who gets to decide what it means? It's a question that's at the heart of pretty much every modern social movement. And as this whole situation shows us, the answer is, well, it's rarely simple.